Okay. All right. So tonight our topic is not a very fun topic, but is something that was on my mind because of my trip to Israel this past week. Some of you may have heard the story that I told about Rabbi Shmuel Slutky, whose two sons were killed on October 7th. One of them was killed, and his body uh, fell in a fire and was charred beyond recognition. So it took a while for them to be able to identify the body. And this has been an issue now. There have been, when you're dealing with one of the places where we went to um, is the Army base that deals with processing all of the deceased over the last few weeks. And this is an issue that they deal with routinely, which is, zehut, how to identify the remains, especially when a person's remains are damaged and there's not much to go on as far as how to tell who it is. The Gemara deals with this issue in the context of aguna, because that's really the major ramification. Like if a person was single and wasn't attached to anyone and then went missing, and we don't know if he's alive or dead, the ramifications would be as far as maybe a relative sitting Shiva or saying Kaddish for that person. The stakes are not dramatically high. It's just a question of, do I sit Shiva for someone who I don't know whether they're alive or dead? But let's say that person left over a wife, and so that's really the biggest stake. That's the biggest ramification in halacha when you can't identify somebody. And this was a big shiloh that came up after 9/11 as well. And now it's come and been raised again. And so I just wanted to review with you some of the asodos, some of the bases for how we deliberate on these issues using modern technology. And as we'll see, one of the issues is, when can modern technology be invoked and when can it not? And I think we'll see that it's not so clear cut. Um, let's see here. Okay. So you have the sheet in front of you, and the first source for this is in the end of Maseches Yevamos, which deals with the issue of permitting a woman to remarry when her husband has disappeared and is suspected to be dead. So you need to have testimony that the husband is in fact deceased to allow a woman to remarry. We are very lenient in areas of aguna. There's a principle of mishum aguna hitiru, that the chachamim are lenient to not require two witnesses, which is what we would normally require. And instead, we only require one witness. It doesn't even have to be a kosher witness, as long as there's as long as there's a likelihood that this person is telling the truth, and that he gives the proper description. But even with those leniencies, the Mishnah says that there are restrictions. Let's say someone wants to testify that he saw a corpse. I don't know who it was, but can you describe the face? And did you recognize the person based on the face? So the Mishnah says, "Ein me'idin ela al parts of panim im hachotem." The only testimony that we accept is if the testimony is about a person's face together with their nose. In other words, the body, the facial, the face has to be intact. Afal pishiesh simonim begufo uvechelav. And if the face is disfigured or no longer there, let's say the person was decapitated, but you recognize the body or you recognize the clothing that the person wore, those are not admissible signs that the person is dead. You have to recognize the face. The Gemara in Yevamos goes through a lengthy discussion as to whether the principle of simanim are, well, is there a sign? Like, for example, we know that there's a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. And in the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, the person who gives a siman gets the object. So we know that there's a concept of simanim, identification through provision of identifying signs. Well, is that something that the Torah sanctions or does it not sanction? And there's an opinion in the Gemara that simanim are deoraisa, that yes, as long as a person can provide identifying signs about either a lost object or a person, then that is sufficient to ascertain that we are dealing with the object or person in question. So the Gemara therefore asks, if you hold that simanim are legitimate criterion of identification, so then hakitani alpha simanim begufa uvechelav. Then why is it that the Mishnah does not allow a presentation of identifying signs of the person's body or of the person's clothing? So the Gemara answers gufo de aroch the goats. So the Gemara's answer is that the reason why we don't admit a person's description of the body is because it's a very loose description of the body. Just if you say, well, it was a big body, or the person was very tall, or the person was very short, that's insufficient, because there are a lot of people who are tall, a lot of people who are short. And so you can't use that, like Rashi says, lav simanim ninu. That's not enough of an identifying sign. It's too broad of a description. And kelav, the chayshinan l'she'ela. And the reason why clothing is not admissible, you see a guy who, you find a corpse and it has a shirt with, let's say, that we know that this fellow used to wear, or it's got a monogram with his initials on it. So it's clear that it belongs to this guy. Why is that not admissible? And the Gemara answers the chayshinan l'she'ela, because we're concerned that maybe the decedent that we find actually borrowed somebody else's clothes. And maybe the person who is dead that's in front of us is not the guy who really was the owner of the shirt or the coat or whatever it was. So the Gemara then asks, well, if that's the case, the chayshinan l'she'ela chamor b'simani ukaf hechi mahadrinan, then why is it that in the midst of Hashavas Aveda, if a person loses a donkey and you find the donkey and that you ask for a siman, you say, show me a sign that it's your donkey, as long as the fellow says, well, it has this kind of saddle, so then that's enough to get your donkey back. Why don't we say maybe the saddle or the whatever they call the thing they put on a donkey? Is it a saddle? I guess it would be a saddle or some what? No, ukaf is really a saddle, or maybe it is or some kind of strap. But he says, why is that sufficient? Because don't you have to worry that maybe it was lent out to another donkey? So the Gemara says, lo shaili in shiuchba demaskiv le lechamra. So the Gemara says, no, there are certain types of coverings or garments that are never lent out. When you have a particular dress or saddle dress for your donkey, you don't switch it from one donkey to another, because the saddle is customized for the unique contour of that donkey. And if you were to put it on another donkey, it would actually bruise or injure the other donkey because it's customized. So let's say you find, I guess an example would be a guy was wearing orthotics, and the orthotics had the name of the person on the bottom of the orthotics that were inserted into the shoes. So that might be something that you would say, well, that's a signifying sign, because that's not something that would have been lent out to another person, or any other kind of apparatus. So what you see from the Gemara itself is that it all depends. When it comes to identifying signs, and you'll see why this is relevant to the case in question that I mentioned, is that if there is a type of clothing or accoutrement that is attached to the body, jewelry, or anything else that is attached to the body that the person would never have lent to another person, and you can't identify the remains based on the face, but you find something that is unique to that person that he would not have lent to somebody else, so then you could use that as an identifying sign. Now, I will tell you this. Let's say a person is lost in battle and they were wearing dog tags, right? Or they were wearing a military uniform with their name on the uniform. So based on this, what we're learning now, since a person would not lend his dog tags to somebody else, that's the reason that many times the army will give you dog tags for that very reason, because it's the only way to identify the body. Have there been cases where people have faked their death and put their dog tags on a charred corpse? Sure. But when you're trying to be matir and aguna, it seems from the Gemara that you don't have to be choshesh for that level of deception. That would be enough to identify the body. Yeah, Eddie. That what? Well, that's a good question. It would depend. We'll have to see if that's considered to be. Well, let's say there's a birthmark. What about a birthmark? Well, how distinctive is the birthmark? How distinctive is the tattoo? Right? It just says mom, and there's a bunch of guys who have mom on their shoulder. Maybe that's not enough. But if it's clearly a unique kind of artistry, that probably would be enough. Now, that's not going to help when you have a body that's charred, right? Okay. Now, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins in Ibn Ezra, based upon this discussion in the Gemara, Mitzauhu, this is source number 3. Mitzauhu harugo mate, if a person is found killed or died of natural causes, im padachto v'chotmo, parts of panav kayamim, if his forehead, his nose, and his general facial features are still intact, ruhu bahem shuhu ploni, and the people who find the body recognize who that person is, so me'idin olav, they can testify, and their testimony is accepted to be matir and aguna. Nital echad me'elu, but if one of the identifying signs of the face is missing, afal pi sheyesh lahem simanim muvhakim biyoser b'chelav, even if there are identifying signs on the person's clothing that clearly identify that this was the clothing that belonged to that guy, einam klum dechayshinan l'she'ela. That's not admissible because you have to worry that the person may have lent his clothes to somebody else. Now, there's a sefer called Otzar HaPoskim that I'll show you. It's a set of svarim that deals with halachos of Ibn Ezra halachos, Evan HaEzer halachos, having to do with marriage. And a full 3 volumes of this Otzar HaPoskim deal with the whole issue of what simanim are necessary to be matir and aguna, deal with this particular siman yud zayin. And it goes on for pages and pages and pages. An example of something that a person wouldn't lend to somebody else is his underwear, right? Just for obvious reasons. You don't want to lend no one's going to want to wear your underwear if you're in the military. That's just something that you wouldn't lend. So if you find a body that has monogrammed underwear and you can make out the underwear, that would be a legitimate thing because no one's going to lend that. So va'afilu hayu lahem simanim begufo va'afilu shuma ein meidin alav. And the Shulchan Aruch continues and says that even if there are simanim in a person's body, like a mole or a birthmark, that's not enough to testify because that's not a siman, even though it's a siman muvhak, even though it's a clear siman, but it's not enough. Aval hayu lahem begufo simanim muvhakim biyoter. But if they're extremely distinguishing marks on the body, something that 1 in a million people would have in that particular place, so then that's enough, right? And the Shulchan Aruch doesn't go into that much detail, but it has to be truly unique. And the Rama says, Kagon shahayalo yeter o chaser. So the Rama gives us examples. O shinui be'echad me'evar. Let's say a person has an extra finger, he had a sixth finger, or a sixth or webbed toes, or a person was missing a finger on a certain hand, or he had a deformity on one of his limbs. That would be considered to be a siman mufhak bioter. Aval katan o aruch o chiver v'sumak lo havi siman mufhak. But if just by saying that, the body was a certain measurement, either large or small, or the skin was either white or reddish, that's not enough of a siman. And even if you have 100 simanim, but none of those 100 are distinguishing enough in and of itself, you cannot conjoin multiple simanim to permit the woman to remarry. Even if there's other circumstantial evidence, that's not enough to be mater and aguna.
Potentially be more than a single semen in combination if the whole idea is to be, exceed a certain level of doubt to be mater.
It's a very good question. I don't know the answer, but that's a very fair question. Why not? If you're concerned about, getting to this, it nears a statistical impossibility that it's not this guy, because there's such a multiplicity of signs that this is the person. But apparently, Chazal required there to be one defining siman that stands out. That seems to be the rule, and I'm not sure the reason why.
Multiple of those still doesn't increase your statistics anything, right? Well, and actually it does, but I think if, let's say the bar is 90%, and you have, 8 things that are 70%, they would combine statistically, and he's saying a filumea, right?
Height, weight, eye color, these are all, each one runs 50-50. So
Well, I mean, not each of these are that.
but those are the examples that he's talking.
Whatever.
Okay.
A little more identifying than just.
So Gabshushit could allow chotamo if a person has a big bump on his nose, o shechotamo akuma harbe o kedoma lazeh, or he's got a very crooked nose. Very few people have such a crooked nose, or things that are like that are somewhat unique. Avi siman mufak, that's a sufficient siman. Aval ma'ata kumalo, but if it's just slightly crooked, just like a Jewish nose, that's not enough. Uhu adin l'roshim shebegufo o be'echad me'evarav. And similarly, if there's just like a mark, some kind of discoloration on his skin, that's not going to be enough. Aval shinayim gedolim afal pisha gedolim harbe lo havi siman mufak. The person had big teeth, for example, large incisors or something like that. That's not considered to be a siman mufak. V'chol siman hamahani b'Yisrael hameid hu adin ba'ovid kol chavim hamesiach lefi tumo. And anytime a siman will work, when a Jew testifies, and it will also work if a non-Jew testifies by way of mesiach lefi tumo, when he's not aware that his testimony is going to be the criterion for something very dramatic, halachically. Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, dental x-rays are very distinctive. That's a good point, Harold. If you can, and that's many times how they identify. I remember when I was growing up, there was an actor named Jack Cassidy who died in a fire in Hollywood. And the only way they were able to identify his remains was through his dental records, right? So that would also probably be a siman mufak. Now, the Be'er Heitev, in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, says that there are times when even clothing can be admitted as a siman. And he first says, Ayin Knesses Hagdola, and then he says, Tzitzis Sha'alav Adif Mitabas Kis Va'arniki, v'lo chayshinan l'she'ela. One of the situations where we're not choshesh that a beged was lent out is a pair of tzitzis. It's like an undergarment, right? And therefore, it's excuse me, it's a more reliable siman than a tabas, than a ring that a guy was wearing, a wallet, or a money bag that a person was that was found on a person, because those are things that a person might lend to somebody else, but he wouldn't lend his tzitzis to somebody else. Kameya lo chayshinan l'she'ela. If a person is found with an amulet, which is usually the amulets were custom made for the individual, so people would not lend them out. Im ein minhag makom lilbosh oso malbush elohu lo chayshinan l'she'ela. Another feature of this halacha is that if a person is the only person in his neighborhood who wears a certain kind of garment, let's say, he was known to wear plaid shirts, I don't know, or he wore bow ties, right? And nobody else wears a bow tie. There are very few people in our shul who wear bow ties, right? What's another example of a type of clothing that's very distinctive that no one else wears? Okay, Kenzine. Okay. All right. So anything that is something that only one person would wear, so then you don't have to worry that he lent it out. No one is going to lend out their Montreal Canadiens jersey, that's for sure. Okay, right. But he quotes then hayalo nezem ba'ozno. If a person had an earring, okay, so that's lo chayshin. The chuvas the chuvas ra'anach brings that lo chayshin and l'she. They don't have to worry that maybe that was lent out to somebody else. Avalhu cholek alavu sfirle the chayshin and l'she, but he holds that no. He holds that you do have to worry with earrings that maybe it was lent to somebody else. Then he goes on. He says, "Hada chayshin l'she'ela dafka chayfetz echad oshnayim she'eno tzarech lahem v'yucholios below osam kalim." He says the only time that we're worried that he may have lent out a garment and therefore this is not the person that you think it is only if you can ascertain that the person who used to wear this garment did not need that garment. It wasn't a vital garment for him. Or let's say, for example, they have other clothes. Babayit. But let's say a person left his house with only the clothes on his back, and then all of a sudden he disappears. His wife says he didn't pack for a long trip. He just went for a stroll up the mountain in the back, right? And they find a body that's disfigured and they can't recognize it, but it's got his clothes on. Since he didn't pack a change of clothing, that also will be a siman, because who would have taken off his clothes and allowed himself to walk around naked? Okay? That's the argument as to why you can rely on the fact that this, unless you'd make the argument that they swapped clothes. The guy swapped clothes with the corpse, right? Which I guess you don't have to be choshesh for. So this is like a similar situation. A guy gets on a boat trip with only one change of clothing, and you find the corpse on the boat with that clothing. So then you don't have to be choshesh that he lent his clothing to somebody else because he didn't have another change of clothes. And the Knesset Hagdola even disagrees with the Beis Yosef on the issue of a ring or a wallet or a money bag. He felt that those are personal effects. And even though the Beis Yosef felt that that's not a distinguishing siman, because people might lend out those items, Knesset Hagdola disagrees. And there he brings other poskim who feel that way as well. So there's a lot of machlokes as to what is and is not considered to be an identifying article of clothing. And certainly, b'chosam shekosav shmo v'kinu yo. And certainly, if let's say it's a type of ring which has a signet or a symbol on it, which has his initials or his name on it, or let's say a family crest on it, and it's really not the norm for other people to wear that or to lend it out. Lo chayshinan shema shmo v'kinu yo kach keven v'lo huchzak ayin sham. And you don't have to worry that maybe this is a duplicate of another ring that looks exactly the same. So as you see, even though the Shulchan Aruch is machmir, that clothing is not a siman when you cannot identify the body, nonetheless, there are many exceptions to this rule, okay? You'll see why that's relevant shortly. Now, I want to talk about, for the remainder of the shiur, before I tell you the story about one of the sons of Rav Slatky, whose body was charred beyond recognition, there is a traditional discussion about when you can and cannot use new technology as admissible evidence for these kinds of purposes. One of the first discussions of this was the issue of fingerprints, which certainly is several generations old, where fingerprints was already something that probably even Sherlock Holmes was using back in the 19th century. So he quotes in the Sefer Otzar HaPoskim, he quotes, B'yarchon HaPardes Tammuz Tafshin Yud Gimel, Yatza Harav Reb Dov Borstein Ladun Diyesh Lizahot Adam Meit, Asher Partzuf Panav Nishchat Al Yedei Sheyatiku Tivias Etzba'osav Al Haniyar, I'm not sure what that word is, V'yishveh zeh l'tivias ha'etzbos shenishar mimenu beveso, al echad hamismachim harishmiyim. So basically, he writes, this is Tafshin Yud Gimel, this is 1943, right? So you don't know whether the person is who we think he is because his body is disfigured. So if you can still get the fingerprints, so you compare the fingerprints of the corpse to fingerprints that were present in his house on, let's say, items that he had touched in his house. And you compare the two sets of prints. And this is what the police routinely do in order to incriminate people. He says, because since it is already accepted by the scientists of the day, shahakavim v'hasirtutim me'etzba'ot adam einam shavim eitzel b'nei adam, that everyone has a unique set of fingerprints. It's an interesting language that he uses, but all of the grooves and the lines on a person's fingers are unique, that no two people have the exact same fingerprints. He says, "Ve'ein af echad hadoime lechaver bekavim ha'ela b'shum mikra, ulefi divreihem gam acharei hamavet kol od lo nirkav haguf nisheret sidrat hasirtutim ha'ela she'al ha'etzba'ot kayemet b'li shum shinoi." And therefore, so long as the body has not decomposed, it could be even days after the death has occurred, but the fingerprints will remain intact and they don't change. Okay, and therefore you can use fingerprints as an identifying siman. Imkain yesh ladun dezeh havi siman muvhak. He says, therefore, the argument can be made that this is a siman muvhak. Shaharei geder siman muvhak katav hamasus binyamin v'hu kol shelo yimatze be'echad me'elef. This goes back to Michael's question. He says, what is the definition of a siman muvhak? He says, if it's not something that can be found in more than 1 in 1,000, in other words, statistically, this is less than 1 in 1,000 that would have this particular set of identification, then you can rely on that and determine that that's the person you're dealing with. He says, "V'kol shekain bazeh shelefi edus hamumchim lo yimatze afilu bein alfei alafim v'ribo revavan shel mikrim dimyon b'tvias ha'etzbos shel ha'echad lemishnei." And that certainly would be true, therefore, with a set of fingerprints, because since you won't find two people even in 1,000 myriad, right? In other words, 1 in 1 million. You can't even if you took 1 million people, you would not find two people with the same fingerprints. Therefore, this is a legitimate what's called a siman muvhak. Ubevada yesh lismoch al edus harofim b'chachmei ha'anatomia bazeh. And therefore, we should rely on the scientists of the day, the anatomists of the day, and if they tell us that fingerprints are unique to each person, we can rely on that. Shaharehu inyan galui v'nira la'ein kol. Because it is something that is self-evident. In other words, it's not something that we're just taking their word for it, but we can actually test it. And since it's something that's testable, no scientist is going to make a claim that can be refuted so easily. And therefore, it must be that what they're telling us is true. וגם יש רגליים לדבר, לשער דכמו דבגימל דברים אדם משתנה מחברו, דהיינו בקול ובמראה ובדס, כמו כן גם במבנה האור וסרטוטי האצבעות. He says, and also logic dictates that just like Chazal tell us that in three ways every person is unique and different from his fellow, that each person's voice is unique, each person's appearance is unique, and each person's thinking process is unique. It only makes sense to suggest that the way that their fingerprints are constructed should also be unique. Ein b'nei adam domim ze lazeh. Ve'ein ze nechshav begeder efshel levarer al yedei shenishva harbe tvias etzvos shel alfei ha'anoshim lir'osim domo ze lazeh. So he says, maybe you'll challenge this, and you'll say, maybe we should not accept modern science's assertion that fingerprints are unique until we test it out ourselves in Basin. Maybe we should have to take a few thousand samples, take their fingerprints, compare them, and verify that the scientists are telling us the truth. And he means this. Right. But you see, the point he's making is that maybe you could argue that we shouldn't be so prepared to accept just because modern scientists testify this doesn't necessarily make it so. Why shouldn't we be required to do our own sort of forensic analysis as to whether fingerprints are unique or not? One second, before I take the question, let me just see what he answers. He says, ad shenema de'ein la'amin l'rofim ad shenevarer. Maybe you should say, we should not believe doctors until we test it ourselves. The Maharami Lublin had written explicitly that when there's something that you can verify on your own, you should not just trust a, so to speak, medical expert or scientific expert based on their authority, but you should verify that they're telling the truth. He says, the reason why we don't say that is and the answer that he gives is because since it would involve a tremendous amount of effort to get together thousands upon thousands of people and compare their fingerprints, it's not considered to be feasible. And therefore, it's not something that we can verify independently. So in other words, and this is, I think, a very, very important tshuva, he says, if scientists tell us something and they say that it's tried and tested in the laboratory, but we, the Basin, have no independent verification, if we can verify it ourselves to make sure that they're telling the truth, we should, unless it is something that is so impractical to verify because we simply lack the instrumentation or the resources to be able to verify it ourselves, then we would be allowed to rely on modern science's assertions. Okay? So one second, I just wanted to, Chaim, did you want to say something? I think the reason is because there are many things, especially in Well, I think it's true even in the modern times as well. There are constantly retractions that are made about medical discoveries, and because of that, you can't always, just because the latest medical discovery says this, doesn't mean that it becomes the gospel, right? Right? There used to be a time when eggs were bad for you, right? And now eggs are good for you. And there used to be a time when fat was bad for you, and now certain kinds of fat are good for you. And there's a lot of things that switch over the course of time in the realm of medical discovery and scientific discovery. So therefore, he says, since it's not 100% reliable and things could change, try to verify it first if there's a claim that's made by the scientific community. But if it's not practical to do so, then you can rely on it. Yes, Eddie.
The court system, but the prosecutor, you got the defense, if there's an issue with regards to fingerprints, they themselves would test it and it would come up and over at least a certain amount of time that it's proven that it's correct.
Right. So it could be that by the time we get to the mid or late 20th century, it's already a verified science, right? But perhaps in the early part of the 20th century, it wasn't a verified scientific fact yet. Maybe. Yeah, right. So if a certain amount of time has passed and everyone uses it as the criterion, then perhaps. Okay, anything else before we move on? Okay, let's go to our final source for tonight and discuss sort of a review that was written a few years ago of the utilization of DNA evidence to determine someone's identity. Okay, and this is part of a larger essay. It was written by a young posek in Eretz Yisrael by the name of Rav Yoshua Pfeffer, who's got a lot of videos online. He's a big Talmud Chacham. But he, in the course of discussing a lot of cases where we use DNA to verify identity, like one of the examples is the child, who's the father? Mama's baby, daddy's maybe. How do we identify who the baby is? And the answer is, can you use DNA evidence to identify the paternity of the child? And then, in the course of this discussion, Rayat DNA lahatir agunot. When can we use genetic proof, DNA proof, to prove that someone is deceased? Nefilatam hatragit shel migdalei hateomim umotam hamiyadi shel alafim, he says, the great tragedy of the Twin Towers and the instantaneous death of thousands of people, sipka l'rabanim mikol ha'olam she'elot kvedot mishkal, raised a number of questions from Rabbanim all over the world where men were died instantaneously in a fire. Their bodies were completely, vaporized or carbonized. And how do you verify that their wives are now permitted to move on with their lives and remarry? Bein elu shenisfu b'migdalim hayu mispar gvarim shegufoteim lo zohu. Ach shenimtzeu mehem ikvot DNA b'kerev ha'harisot. He says there were people whose bodies could not be identified, but there was still genetic material of the corpses that was still present among the rubble of the towers. So nish'ala efo ha'she'ela. So the question is raised: Hayim nitan lahatir et nishoteim shel anashim elu al smach rayat DNA? Can you use DNA evidence to permit these women to remarry? Kasher gufo shel adam nimsa bishleimuto toch shloshe yamim mimoto hamishuar nifsak b'shulchan aruch shenitein lezahot et ha'adam ima partzuf kolel achotem lo nifka. He says, he quotes the Shulchan Aruch that we saw above, that when a person's body is intact and the facial features are completely intact, including the nose, so then you can allow the woman to remarry based on that testimony. But beheder partzuf shalem nitan lehistamech al simanim kedei lezahot et hagufa. In the absence of the facial features being intact, you can rely on certain simanim to identify the body. Bifrat yesh tzorech b'siman muvhak biyoter k'dei lahatir et ishto shel adam al pi simanei zihui. So you would need very identifiable or very unique simanim in order to permit a woman to remarry. So Habei Shmuel v'Aruch HaShulchan mevi as divrei shut masas binyamin hakovea es hacriterion shel siman muvhak biyoter b'siman hamatzui be'echad mini elef. So as we learned before, the masas binyamin says that the criterion is that it has to be statistically less than 1 in 1,000 that the chances of this person having that particular sin. Im hasimen mofia be'echat o pachot mitoch elef anashim, nechshav hasimen lemuvhak berama kezu shenitein leistamech alav litzorchei zihui. And if therefore it's less than 0.1% statistically likely that anyone else would have this particular siman, then you can allow a woman to remarry based on that. לסימנים פחותים בינוניים יש פוסקים שיסכימו להתיר על פי צירוף שני סימנים או צירוף של סימן עם ראייה נוספת. There are poskim who do allow you to conjoin less unique simanim together, like Michael was trying to argue, or with other types of arguments in Riyah Nosefet, or Raya Nosefet, some other kind of proof that would be, additional circumstantial evidence. Biachas Rayat DNA, Pasuk Rav Vosner, she'ein lekabel Rayat DNA ela kisiman beinoni. Rav Vosner was not prepared to say that DNA independently is enough of a siman to allow a woman to remarry. He said it's a siman beinoni. It's a siman, but it's not a siman amuvhak biyoter. He says, "Ba'ofen shenitein lahatir adam al pi rayat DNA b'tziruf im rayot nosafot." He says you would need DNA, plus you would need additional circumstantial evidence that can be conjoined with the DNA evidence in order to allow women to remarry. Rav Vosner hidgish et hadifut shel makor DNA mitoch ha'adam ha'chaser atzmo, kegon se'ar mitoch ha'mavreshet or rok mimavreshet shinayim, al pnei makom DNA mikrovei mishpacha. And Rav Vosner felt that there was an advantage to taking the person's own DNA, let's say from a hairbrush or a toothbrush, over collecting DNA from family members who are closely related as a criterion for establishing identity. But on the other hand, we have another, yeah. Beinoni, right. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the Sugya to tell you that this is Rav Vosner's own term, but it seems to me that what is meant by Beinoni is that it's a siman, it's muvhak, but it's not muvhak biyoter. It's more than just tall or short or white or pink skin. Yeah, right, right. Yeah, right. No, I think muvhak biyoser would be a missing finger or an added finger. I think that would be muvhak biyoser, because we said that's admissible. It could be just siman muvhak is what he means by Beinoni. It's not correct. Right. So that's why I'm saying. Right. Well, if we're going to use the Masas Binyamin's criteria, siman Beinoni means that it's unlikely that anyone else would have this, but it doesn't rise to 1 in 1,000. In other words, more than. Well, okay. So hold on. Let's see. So Rav Vosner, because perhaps it was a new technology, and maybe it was not perfected at the time when he wrote the tshuva, he wasn't prepared to rely on it independently. Mineged, Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who he writes in the parentheses, Shekosav ba'arichus hanose, right? Masik she raya DNA nechshevet kesiman muvhak biyoter, like lasers argue. He felt that it is a siman muvhak biyoter. Shekain hahistavrut litot huzeera. He says, Bein echad lemilyard levein echad likventillion. So it's like 10 to the 18th accuracy. Okay? Bevadai she'ola harbe al Shiur al shut masas binyamin. Right? And certainly, therefore, it goes well above the bar that the Masas Binyamin had raised for us. Harav Goldberg mashve bein rayat DNA lebein pisko shel shut ein Yitzchak lepiv nitar lahatir ishal smach tmunaso shel hane'edar. He says the psak of the ein Yitzchak was that you, as long as you have a photograph of the deceased and it looks like the deceased, you can be matir in aguna. If so, you can certainly be matir based on the DNA, which is almost as good as which is even better than a photograph, right? Kach yesh letzayin shekachol hanira das Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach hayta shenitan listamech al rayat DNA kirayat absolutit b'chol chatchumei ha'halacha. It seems also that Rav Shlomo Zalman felt that way, that DNA evidence is absolutely reliable in and of itself. Now, Izkarnu le'el et pikpukam al haposkim b'istamchut al rayat DNA b'yachas likviat mamzerus. He says, we've already written that you can accept DNA evidence to determine whether the child is a mamzer. Let's say it's a paternity question. But some poskim question it based on the fact that even though the science is accurate, but the people who perform the science may not be accurate. In other words, the people in the lab are subject to make errors, or who knows, maybe they'll get paid off, maybe, mistakes can happen in the lab, whether accidentally or deliberately. V'ulam b'nogea leheter agunot poskim rabim hiskimu sheyesh lihistamech al bedikos DNA v'lo lachshoch lekach. But when it comes to aguna, many poskim say that it's sufficient, even though there are human errors that occur in the lab, you can rely alone on DNA. Hasiba lekach hi sheb'nogea la'agunot halacha hi sheyesh lismoch afal eidutam shel goyim kedei lahatir isha mikvalei aginuta. That the reason is because we create many heterim to permit an aguna, including accepting the testimony of Gentiles. And therefore, you can rely on the testimony of the government authorities to say that a person is deceased in order to be matir and aguna. Gam b'shut igros Moshe histamech Harav Feinstein al edusu shel Misrad Hagana Ha'amerikani lepiha matot shel gever ne'edar tzanach letoch hayam b'meshech milchemet olam hashniya. I'm not sure that Rav Moshe was somech on the military office in America, which mitot shel gever nedar tzanach letoch hayam. Yeah, a pilot crashed into the ocean. Yeah, maybe that's what it means. Aha, okay. Okay, very good. So biyachas lemigdalei hateomim, and therefore, when it comes to the Twin Towers, pasak ba'ota ruach Harav Zalman Nechemya Goldberg shenitein lismach al eduta shel chevra tu'ufa lepiha ba'al nedar haya nochach al echad hamatusim sheitnagshu b'migdalim. And therefore, let's say there's a plain manifest that says that the husband was on the flight that crashed into the Twin Towers. Now, is it possible that he sort of wasn't on the flight? Yes, but it's extremely unlikely. And therefore, you can rely on the plane's manifest that says that he was on that flight to be matir and aguna. Again, it's basing yourself on the authorities. Even a private enterprise like an airline wants to preserve its good name as being a good record keeper, and therefore there's like an added argument to be made that they're reliable as far as their testimony. There's certainly no reason why the airline would lie about this. Because they can certainly get into trouble with liability issues if they were to try anything that was untrue. That's right. Well, yeah, but that in itself is not enough. There are many times people fake their death, right? If right. Or he paid someone in the airline to add his name to the manifest. But that for the airline to agree to do that and to admit liability for his death would not make any sense for the airline to do. Al smach hanal Beit Hadin shel America histamech al bedikot DNA שבוצע על ידי רשויות הבריאות של ארצות הברית כדי להתיר את נשים הבעלים הנעדרים. And it is for that reason, Bate Din in America, or the Beis Din of America, which is part of the RCA's Beis Din, did rely on DNA evidence alone to permit women to remarry. And as he says, as in his conclusion, he says, Bishnat Tafshin Tet Zayin, Sirev Beis Din Harabani b'Chaifa la'achriya sheila shel avhut al pi re'iyah mada'it toch shehu min hamek. He says in 1957, the Beis Din of Haifa refused to use a blood test as definitive evidence of the paternity of a child. And their explanation was, Hamada holechu mitpateach miyom liyom. Their argument was that science or medical knowledge continues to advance daily. Itachen shemasha hamada kovea ka'et eina kivia sofit vehechletit. He says it could be what science has established as fact today may not be the final word on that matter. And who knows, maybe one day down the road, 20 years or 40 years from now, they'll discover that blood types are not unique to individuals, and there are certain crossovers of different kinds of blood types for different people. ואין לקבוע באופן משפטי אבהותו של ילד על יסודות דרכי המדע המשתנה מתקופה לתקופה. And therefore, you can't rely on the medical knowledge of today if it's something that's brand new, because it may change. It's subject to change. Kiyom, however, today, דומה הפוסקים המוכנים לדחות ראיית DNA על סמך ביקורת נגד ראיות מדעיות מתמעטים והולכים. He says those poskim who are the doubting Thomases of DNA evidence are becoming smaller and smaller. In other words, the more that DNA technology becomes more and more advanced, the more we have the opportunity to rely on it authoritatively without being doubted. במרוצת השנים נהיו ראיות DNA חלק מהותי ובסיסי של בתי המשפט בארצות הברית ובאנגליה. He says it's certainly true that in both America and in England, DNA evidence is considered to be a criterion of evidence. וכיום, גם בישראל משמשות ראיות DNA כראיות חותכות במשפטים פליליים. And even in Israel today, they use DNA evidence for serious issues in legal issues. לדיני התורה חוקים ומשפטים ייחודיים, ועם זאת נראה שראיית DNA עתידים לשמש תפקיד מרכזי בראיות מתקבלות בתחומי הלכה רבים. And granted, we know that halachic criteria are not always the same as scientific criteria, but nonetheless, it seems that DNA is becoming more and more accepted as an accepted halachic criteria even today. Ad kan. Now, I'm going to leave you with this, okay? So, the reason I wanted to bring this all together for you is because Rav Slatky told us the following story. His son was burned beyond recognition. They did a DNA test. The DNA result was, this is not your son. They kept looking for their son. Several days later, they did another DNA test. DNA test came back and said, this is not your son. But they were very, very upset. They wanted to study the body more. And so there were two other criteria that they relied on in order to identify that this was indeed Rabbi Slatky's son. Number one, they found a watch on the corpse. And by doing an internet search on the face of the watch, they were able to identify that this indeed was the watch that was given to him as a gift. And it was a pretty distinctive face of a watch that was probably not worn by that many people. And then finally, they found a ring. And the ring I think it was found nearby the corpse. It wasn't on the actual corpse, it was found nearby the corpse. And it had the initials of the decedent's grandfather, who was a jeweler, who had manufactured that ring, and that ring had been passed down in the family. And that was the final sort of ruling that the Beis Din came to. Later, this decedent had a twin brother. They took the twin brother's DNA, compared it to the charred remains, and they found a match. So, why am I telling you this? Right? Because it was very surprising to us when we heard this. It's true that DNA is a very strong scientific criterion, and like you said, Laser, it's like more than 1 in a trillion. But there are errors that are still being made because perhaps the instrumentation is not precise. Perhaps there are contaminants that are introduced into the system. And as as was admitted in this article, human error can always be a part of the misidentification. So it's not so outlandish that Rav Vosner required an additional criterion other than DNA evidence in order to verify that the person is who we believe him to be. And so I just wanted to share that with you, and just keep that in mind. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know.
Second question. Can you say something?
Yeah, I don't believe so. I don't believe that the Beis Din.
Match it to the person's own material. It has to be matched to their own. It couldn't be done independently. It has to be matched to their hair sample or blood or something. That's where you don't know what race.
Well, the other question I have is, in some ways, what you're saying is, let's say for Mamzer, you can go the other way. You can say that people made a mistake and it really is not a Mamzer and stuff like that. You can use it in a different way. If you say,
Yeah, and that's why it's probably a good idea to get additional verification, because let's say you want to verify that this child either is a mamzer or is not a mamzer, it may be worthwhile to go the extra mile. Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know where he got this from. Okay. All right.